Hi everyone, Ashley here and welcome back to Dress It Yet. Today I'm bringing you a video about where you can find vintage clothing, which can be a really daunting thought when you first get into vintage clothing. Where do you start? So I compiled a list, some of which I have tried and some of which I haven't, just purely based on my personal shopping preferences. So I kind of made a list that went beyond what I would do just because other people might feel comfortable with them. So I made a list of just ways to get started, places to look, and in each of those kind of what to look out for. The first place I definitely recommend you looking, and it's my personal favorite, is just your local run-of-the-mill thrift store like Goodwill. So my local is a Goodwill, and almost every piece of true vintage clothing that I have has come from this Goodwill. You just look through the racks and racks and racks and you find things that, you know, are like treasure. It's like a treasure trove. You just have to find the gems that you're looking for. I have found, like I said, so many vintage pieces from just my regular Goodwill. And you know, vintage clothing can be really expensive if the person knows what they're selling. So Goodwill is or your local equivalent, is a great way to find affordable, true vintage clothing. I cannot stress this enough. Yeah, it takes a bit of time. You definitely have to look through a lot of duds to find these great pieces, and you have to like inspect them thoroughly and all of that, but it really pays off, and you can get them for, you know, just like a trade-off a little bit of your time. You can have really affordable vintage clothing. So my second recommendation is kind of a two-parter. I've tried half of it and the other half I haven't tried. So that's like estate sales and garage sales. I've never been to an estate sale before, and I know I'm missing out for sure. Maybe when the world kind of becomes like a little bit easier to get around, I will definitely try to go to an estate sale, but I've never actually been to one. And like I said, I know I'm missing out on that opportunity, so I need to get on that. So don't be like me, go to a estate sale when it's safe again and like find those vintage things there, because they're ripe with a lot of great stuff. And then of course your local garage sales. Again, another thing I haven't done in a while, but I have found so many gems, not so much clothing, but wow, I'm sure someone's cleaning out grandma's house. That's like gonna be an amazing opportunity to find some really good vintage clothing for like a couple bucks. So definitely keep your eye out when you're at garage sales for those racks of clothing. Especially it looks like everything else might be old or cool or vintage on the other tables and everything. Definitely check out the rack, don't pass the rack up. But yeah, along with clothing, garage sales are a great place to find a lot of cool vintage things. The next recommendation is also one I haven't tried yet. Like making this list really made me think of like all the opportunities I was personally missing to find great vintage clothing. So this was like a great learning experience for me. And it is flea markets. I've been to flea markets before, but I've never went with the eye of like vintage clothing. And this one can get a bit tricky as far as affordability, because usually if you find at a flea market, I feel like if you go to a booth that is all vintage clothing, that's what they specialize in, and the prices are gonna be higher. But, you know, sometimes you find that piece and you're like, I don't care what it costs, I want it, you know, and it probably would be fairly reasonable because you are at a flea market. But just keep your eyes peeled at flea markets and, you know, just have a look. Sometimes you'll find, like I said, a booth that maybe has just a hodgepodge of things, and you can find a really good deal there. But there might be also some specialized booths that have vintage clothing that's worth taking a look at. True Vintage Store is my next recommendation. So that is actual brick and mortar stores that specialize in vintage clothing only. Okay, so this is gonna cut down on that it's already curated. It's curated for you. You know, you're gonna save time there because everything's already been curated. Sometimes they do it by decade and all of that. So you know, they know what they're doing, they know what they have, and you know, to have it curated and to save time, you are going to pay the price for that. Some people are fine with that. If you want to like really get into vintage clothing or try it out, you don't want to like put a lot of money into it to see if you like it, I would avoid true vintage stores at first maybe. And you know, like I said, maybe try Goodwill, garage sales and stuff like that to like get started and see if you like it. And then if you really want to like invest, this would be a good place to go. Yeah, like I said, you're going to pay higher premiums here because they know what they have. So I tend to get spooked when I go into true vintage stores. I love looking at all of the items they have. I rarely buy things from there because I just feel, I get sticker shock from them. So have a look. I have found things for good deals. I have a dress that I got at Blue Velvet Vintage in Austin, I believe. I got a dress from there, and it was a really great store. So I'm not saying like never set foot in a true vintage brick and mortar, but you know what you're kind of to expect when you're going in there. You're gonna pay higher prices, but everything's gonna be curated, and you're gonna, have to go through like old t-shirts from like old races from 2005 or something that you have to deal with at Goodwill. So yeah, so just keep that in mind. It's definitely something that if you're kind of have your eye to investing in vintage clothing, then I would check out those places. So the last place I recommend looking are the online resellers. Those places like eBay, Etsy, Poshmark, etc., etc. There's tons of places that resell vintage clothing. I don't tend to go this route because I feel like maybe the return policy isn't as good. Vintage sizes are completely different than today's sizes, and while usually they do provide measurements and that does help, I find sometimes that can be off because you measure yourself maybe differently than they measured the garment, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. So I get a little bit antsy about them, but lots of vintage YouTubers and other people have had great success buying from these resellers. So I don't want you to like be scared of them. It's just something that I don't really go for. And also you probably will, because they're probably selling them piecemeal, they're probably selling one piece at a time, you probably are going to pay a bit of a premium on these. So that's just another thing to keep in mind if you're trying to do it on the cheap. So even though all these tips were on how and where to find true vintage clothing, I have to just end this video by mentioning vintage reproduction. And vintage reproduction is clothing that is inspired by or based on styles, vintage styles. So they are brand new garments that look old or look like stylized and inspired by vintage style. So, and that goes from the 20s all the way up. Like every decade has these, so it's really convenient. And also a lot of vintage pieces, there's one. You see that, it's gone, you get it or it's gone, and whatever. You can't really find another one of them. Vintage reproduction does give you the option. They mass produce them, so you can, there's people walking around with this same shirt that is vintage, a vintage reproduction shirt that's vintage inspired. So there's kind of more opportunity to get some styles that you like. It is more expensive. There is a markup on vintage reproduction, I have found. But I've also been like, I love the pieces so much that I'm willing to pay that investment for them. So if you're a little bit kind of, I don't want to buy actual clothes from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, like actual garments from those times, you can buy brand new garments from those, based on those decades. So definitely check it out. I'll list a few vintage reproduction companies below if you're interested. I actually think I'm going to do a video on all my favorite vintage reproduction companies because I do support a lot of them. So yeah, it's just wanted to throw that tip in there for anyone that's interested in vintage style and vintage clothing. Vintage reproduction is an option for you. So, and I have a mix of both. So you don't have to like choose one or the other. Maybe some other vintage people, or maybe they feel like it's a purist thing. Maybe they only wear true vintage. Whatever. Don't put yourself in a box. Wear what you like. Whether it's vintage reproduction or true vintage, don't worry about it. Just what you can afford, what you're comfortable with, and what you like. And don't worry about the rest. So yeah, so that's all for this video. I hope some of these tips were helpful to you. Like I said, a few of them were helpful to me. I was like, oh God, I'm missing out on this great opportunity to find more vintage goodness. So like I said, hopefully they were helpful to you. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye.